Welcome, everybody. This is the session on discussing discussions, increasing student engagement in online courses. My name is Dr. Alex Gatten. I'm an instructional designer with the School of Social Work, and I am also an instructor in the Doctorate of Social Work program.
Hi, all. I am Rachel Schwartz. I'm with the School of Social Work as well. I'm an assistant professor of teaching, director of our online program, and also assistant dean of innovative learning technologies. So I'm kind of working with all things online. So we're excited to have you listening to us, and I'm going to go over our agenda and get us started. So great. So you just met us, and I'll talk a little bit quickly about our learning objectives, a little bit of context about our program and where we're coming from, some common issues with discussion boards, really looking at like what is the purpose of discussions, why are we using them, giving a little bit of background of what the research shares about the theoretical and empirical frameworks. And then we're going to really dive into some guidelines and suggestions for writing engaging discussion boards for your programs. This is really a presentation that can be applied to you, whether you're an instructional designer, education, faculty member, instructor, even student. You may have some good ideas as well. So thank you all for joining us today. So our learning objectives. So by the end of this session, you will be able to synthesize the research on student engagement in online courses, apply practices for increasing student engagement and learner-to-learner interaction to asynchronous discussion boards, and then support student learning through instructional prompts and strategies, primarily through those discussion boards that we're going to focus on. So our context, so we're coming from the Rutgers School of Social Work. We have a fully online, 100% online MSW program with approximately 600 students. We've been running this program for about 10 years. We started in fall of 2013. And so we've certainly grown over the years. Our students are coming from across the country. We have a lot of students coming from New Jersey, but all across the country. It is an asynchronous program. In terms of our instructional design, we have really grown our program. When we first started, we were sort of this much smaller cohort, smaller number of courses. And so we're offering numbers of sections each semester. And so we've been able to build our in-house instructional design, which has been really wonderful to support our faculty, part-time lecturers and students as well, who are getting the benefit of our engaging courses. And so our faculty coordinators, we name a coordinator at the school who's an expert in their content expert for the class, and they really work closely with our in-house instructional designer, who is Alex, and with myself as program director to create course templates across the program. So we use what we call a master course template that really designates the content is consistent across all of our different sections. And that includes, materials, readings, lectures, course content, small assignments, and discussion boards. So the asynchronous discussion board is often a pretty regular part of weekly modules and is a really important space for that student-to-student engagement as well as instructor-student engagement. And we'll talk more about those different types of engagement styles in a little bit. So as we are thinking about developing our courses and thinking about how discussion boards play such an integral role, some common concerns really come up. So for example, depending on the instructor approach to discussions, we've heard that students maybe are posting too much or too little. Questions and concerns about citation practices. Do students need to be using APA, a rigid APA filing in the discussion boards? If they mention, the author, do they need to be having direct quotes? Kind of what is that line of a discussion having the appropriate citations, giving credit to those who, to the course material, and also ensuring that students are not plagiarizing, right? So kind of finding that balance. Some other concerns that have come up, our discussion board is a space to make sure that students have completed their readings for the week. And these are things that we've heard from our faculty, from our part-time lecturers in discussion, particularly when we're developing these discussions. And another concern is that student replies are brief. So oftentimes the discussion boards are set up where someone is posting an original response to the question and then one or two or more responses to a classmate. So oftentimes it might be, the the very basic, I agree, that's an interesting point. But often, statements like, I like how you described this, but like not really going into much depth or having further substance about the content. So they're not really inquiring further about that person's response. So, and then, in addition to some of those concerns, we know that folks are making some assumptions about discussions. And so, as I mentioned before, a concern about the length, right? So a length of a post indicates something about student engagement. And when we think about that, is that tied to word counts, suggested word counts? Does the post need to be 150 words or a short paragraph? And we'll talk more through some of those guidelines that may be, maybe better or not. Again, other assumptions that discussions exist as ways to make sure students are doing other required work in the class, such as the readings. Discussions should foster meaningful discussion and possibly critique between students, but that they don't. And that discussion should be treated like other kinds of academic work or writing students will produce. And so that kind of goes back to my points around citation and this, and really almost like a formal style of writing. And so, when we're thinking about discussions and when we talk about discussions in the in-person classroom, that conversation may be very different in how we speak. And so, kind of what are those guidelines that we should be thinking about when we're developing the discussion boards, particularly an asynchronous discussion board in an online class. And so as we continue to move through this presentation, we just really want you to consider, what do you use discussions for? So, obviously we're not able to hear your answers, but reflect on this a little bit. And what are you hoping to see? And so, we hope that this next section will help guide some of those thoughts that you've had and maybe change some of those assumptions and also potentially help validate those concerns, but also give you some other ideas and thoughts. And so I am going to pass it over to Alex to talk about some of the research.
Great. So, in order for us to move into, giving you some concrete best practices, we want to lay some foundation as well for, what the research does say, how we know that these are best practices, and so that we can, again, ground our practices in kind of what we do know works or what we've learned, especially, in the last few years where there's really been a lot of activity around, how do we engage student in their coursework. When we're talking about student engagement, engagement kind of broadly refers to students' motivation and kind of perceived effort in a course. And this includes kind of some subcategories such as students' interest. How interested are they feeling in what the course is offering, both in terms of content and also in terms of their interest in participating in various facets of the course, such as discussions. It also includes success and satisfaction, so what are their outcomes in the course at the end? And also, how are they rating the course? How satisfied do they feel with it? And also how they understand their own learning, how much that they understand that they've learned in a course throughout by the end. There's 3 ways to foster engagement. These are different kinds of interactions. So we're talking about these are learner-to-learner, learner-to-content, and instructor-to-learner. We're really going to be focusing on learner-to-learner and learner-to-content. So how's the student, through discussions, how are they engaging with each other and with the course content? And the reason that we're talking about student engagement at all is that student engagement through, as shown in the research, is a major factor in student success and satisfaction in online learning. It's really one of the core pillars, right? And discussions, moreover, are a primary way in which students have the opportunity to experience learner-to-learner engagement, which again is a key piece, of students feeling that they can and want to engage in a course. So the reason that we're really focusing on learner-to-learner engagement and on discussions is that research shows that reading and replying to peers' posts encourages students to negotiate meaning and think critically about the topic. This is something, again, that's demonstrated in studies that have been done on student work in online courses. Discussions also provide low-stakes environments for to test out ideas and writing strategies. So discussions can be places where they're not exams, they're not tests, they're not essays or really formal assignments. It's a place where students feel free to experiment with how they're communicating their ideas and also what they're communicating. Discussions increase motivation via intellectual and social communities that can exist across physical space and time. And so, students are in different time zones. They may belong to different communities. So by creating these spaces where students can come together across space and time, students can create their own community within the course based on both intellectual exchanges, but also based on maybe common kind of social interests as well. Discussions also increase access for those for whom synchronous discussions introduce barriers. So there's a variety of reasons why students feel nervous to speak out loud in a given moment or may not be able to, right? We may have students who, for whatever reason, it takes them a little bit longer to decide what they want to say. It may take them, some more time to really formulate how they want to put something. They may have anxiety about participating immediately for a variety of reasons. Their first language may not be English, so it may take them a little bit longer, first of all, to process what everybody else is saying and then formulate a response to it in a way that they feel comfortable articulating. Or they may be embarrassed about how they communicate in English. So there's all kinds of reasons why somebody may not be able to access synchronous discussions. And if we're talking about an asynchronous class, there's a lot of reasons related to access and what's going on in that student's life, why they would choose to be in an asynchronous class, right? So asynchronous discussions are really beneficial for those students. So when we're talking about student engagement, the two or three primary things that really affect how students engage are self-efficacy, self-regulation, and also metacognition. And we're going to spend a few moments talking about these things. And again, the reason we're talking about these things is that when we talk about engagement and motivation and student success, that really comes down to self-efficacy and self-regulation. And I'll define those in a moment. So self-efficacy refers to students' understanding of their own knowledge and their own ability to do or learn something. So how much self-efficacy they feel in, say, being able to solve some sort of math problem, for example, and knowing that they can solve it. Self-regulation refers to students' ability to determine the best learning strategies that work for them, study strategies, time management strategies, things like that. Knowing basically how they learn and how to regulate themselves in that learning. So asynchronous discussions have been demonstrated to improve self-efficacy, basically students' belief in their own knowledge and skills. So something about that interaction, writing down and synthesizing knowledge in writing and working with their peers on that asynchronously improves students' self-efficacy, their own understanding of their knowledge and skills. We know from research that self-efficacy often correlates with self-regulation. So again, students' abilities to set and meet their own goals and manage their own learning strategies. Both of these things directly affect students' motivation to learn, or what one study refers to as learning presence in an online course. And this study argues that student learning presence is really a big impact on students' success in an online course. So self-efficacy allows students to see perceived failures as opportunities to continue growing and learning rather than kind of indictments against them as learners. So again, this is something that we mentioned earlier, where discussions can be a place for students to test out things without fear of failure, right? And to get feedback on that in the form of their peers' replies. So when we're talking about asynchronous online courses, one big concern instructors have is kind of students lacking the quote unquote traditional classroom space that students may be used to depending on their educational backgrounds, and that instructors don't have the ability to immediately intervene in what's going on in what they see in their classroom and student learning. So based on this, research shows that it's particularly important in asynchronous online classes to foster self-efficacy and self-regulation, however we can, in order to foster student success. So I mentioned metacognition, and self-regulation requires students to develop their metacognitive skills. So metacognition, defined as simply as possible, is knowledge about your own cognition or your own thinking, and awareness of yourself as a learner. So just understanding how you think and why you're thinking what you're thinking. And also being able to assess why, to what extent you understand something and how or why you understand it. And again, metacognition is necessary for both, for the development of both self-efficacy and self-regulation. So courses need to foster metacognition in order to promote learners' assessment of their own learning. And again, these are these key self-efficacy and self-regulation components, right? And to provide them the opportunities and skills to plan, monitor, and assess their own learning strategies. So how can all of this impact discussions, or what role do discussions play? Well, based on this research, we now know some things about online discussions, right? And some of these things may differ from some of the assumptions that Rachel was just reading for us earlier. Discussions can and need to allow opportunity for reflection and metacognition of students' own learning, right? So they need to be a place where students can think about what they know or understand from what they're working on that week in class, and also what they may still be having trouble with. They need to create opportunities to form intellectual and social communities, that students are going to engage in class more when they feel that learner-to-learner interaction, when they feel in community with their peers, and that the course doesn't just feel like kind of an asynchronous independent study that they're having with the instructor, right? Or even worse, like just a completely self-paced class that they're just doing completely by themselves. They also need to make space for students to test out ideas and ways of writing about those ideas. They need to be places where students feel free to take risks, right? And they also need to allow students to negotiate complex meanings, that there should be something that students get the most out of discussions from, based on this research, when they are working through things that are kind of challenging or difficult or not straightforward, right? That there's something that they're really, some sort of complex idea or something to that effect that they're applying or working through, and that kind of thing. So if this is what research shows discussions can or should do, why did instructors voice the concerns that Rachel was talking about earlier, and that she's heard from instructors? Well, we're going to suggest moving forward that has both to do with those assumptions about the purpose of discussions and the way that those discussions have been composed. So,
Okay, sorry.
I'm going to pass it over to Rachel to now give us some concrete practices.
Great, thank you, Alex. So as you're probably sensing, we really want discussions to focus on a few of the key factors that we discussed. So intellectual and social communities, negotiating diverse meetings, risk-taking, development of students' learning practices, and awareness of those learning practices. And so our next couple of slides are going to kind of just talk through a little bit of those points that from the research, but in a give some examples a little bit further. So first point here is, so discussion boards should be formative, not summative. So like Alex was just saying, like low stakes ways for students to test out ideas and think through writing. This is not an assignment that is a high stakes assignment where students are demonstrating mastery. So just think about how you think through ideas, right? Thinking through the content, linked to something in the course, but really like that risk taking behavior to be able to do so without losing those points, having others respond to them, maybe sharing ideas that are not in line with what is something that you thought of, and then you can engage as well with your instructor-learner presence to be part of that discussion. So there's a lot of opportunity to really think about how we frame these discussion boards, that thinking about them as formative, low stakes ways for students to test out ideas. The next piece is discussion boards are collaborative. We're discussing, we're together, we're having conversation, right? So these should not be punitive. So we feel really strongly that discussion boards should not be primarily there to ensure students did the reading. We understand that may be a part of the assignment and part of the discussion. If it's a question, engaging in discussion based on classroom content, then usually it's helpful to have engaged in the reading. But again, thinking about engagement, creating collaborations with your students, it's not just a did you do it or not kind of assignment, and really writing opportunities to engage, learn with each other, reconsider their viewpoints, their own responses, and really for you to engage with them as well. So depending on how things are set up, there could be a lot of opportunity to have that both learner, but also learner-instructor engagement. And so really good, having that collaboration piece, thinking about their own ideas, reconsidering their own ideas, right? So not just putting the answer that they think is right, but then being able to engage with their classmates and have some back and forth, like, again, thinking that we would have in the classroom. So another piece to this, and this goes right along with what I was just saying. So community building. So we know particularly in asynchronous classrooms, engagement and building a sense of community is so key to a student's success and their satisfaction with that, not only the course, but their program. And so assuming the students are not just taking this one course. And so that community building, having discussion board prompts that, and courses that really engage the student learner, particularly in an asynchronous world, helps them develop an intellectual community. Alex mentioned earlier, we don't want discussion boards to feel like an independent study. We don't want students just going in, checking the box. Okay, I answered my question for the week, and not feeling a part of something. And so it can really be a space where students can get to know each other. They can grow together as they create knowledge. It can be really exciting to see that happen, particularly depending on the topic, right? So there's something that someone feels a little bit nervous about sharing or answering a question. When there's not a right or wrong, such direct answer, and it's not punitive, you're going to engage, your students will engage, they'll start to feel more comfortable, they'll cheer each other on, they'll be able to have some of that piece versus, this individual, I go in, I answer my question, I got my points, I got it right, because there's really only like one answer, right? So really thinking through some of these pieces. And then, this feels obvious, right? So discussions really should foster discussions. So we're really wanting open-ended explorations into complex topics, the students' own experiences, new applications of knowledge. And again, these questions might vary depending on the topic that you're teaching, and what you're asking students to bring into the conversation. But open-ended questions are so important, right? So if there's just one answer, that's going to be a pretty boring discussion to read through. If you were in the classroom and you just kind of went around the room and everyone said, yes, no, that might have a purpose, but in an asynchronous classroom, that's probably not going to be the best way to get that information. And so, and you're also, thinking about the learning and the pedagogy behind that, are your students really fully negotiating with the information that they're part of? And so, again, really trying to create opportunities for your students to truly engage in the content in a meaningful way, that for both their knowledge building and for the classroom community piece. So we know that making discussion boards are really that space for community building, for building knowledge, and assessing knowledge as well, but in an open-ended way, collaborative way. And so I'm going to pass back over to Alex to talk about the guidelines for writing discussion prompts and some things to, really tangible things to think about as you're putting these together for your courses.
So before we get right into kind of the concrete guidelines, we want to start with giving you some prompts to think about, right? Before you start writing a discussion. and before you start figuring out how you want to structure that. So these are a few key questions to ask yourself before you start even writing the discussion. So what kind of content have you assigned, and how can a discussion board help determine students' progress in synthesizing and engaging with this content? So we've been talking about discussions as, as low stakes, as formative assessments, but they are still a kind of assessment. They're useful to you as the instructor to figure out where your students are in their learning in terms of the content, right? They're formative, so the goal isn't to assess the students based on their mastery, but we still want to use them as a way to check in and nudge our students' growth in whatever topic. We also want to ask how a discussion board can help them meet the learning objectives for the module. Is the goal to help them work through certain complex concepts that maybe they need some assistance in scaffolding, or maybe new to them? Or are the learning goals for this particular module to apply a framework to something, or to learn about a framework, and so maybe then we need to apply it? And then we really need to ask, what is the benefit of having students speak with and engage with one another about these things? How can they learn from each other's opinions and experiences? So if we're not really if there's really not a lot of benefit for students to talking about it with each other, other than, well, it's our discussion board for the week and we need to have one, then we might need to think about what kind of assignment we're even giving students. So we need to ask ourselves these questions, because if we're not just checking comprehension, but we do still need to advance students' learning, and again, have that kind of formative assessment, we need, as instructors, we need to have a clear idea, or about instruction, or for instructional designers who may be working with instructors, we need to develop a clear idea about what exactly we are using discussions to assess for, and how they will allow students to further their own learning, and really, again, articulate that explicitly in order to help frame those discussions. Okay, so now we get to the fun concretes. So these are our suggested guidelines, again, that we're putting forward based on what we've just outlined to you, not only in our research, but also in terms of our own experiences and best practices. So the first thing is we want to be as specific as possible in what we're looking for, right? So for example, we wouldn't want to say, respond to, I don't know, Judith Butler's ideas about gender performativity, or something to that effect, right? The students aren't going to inherently understand what kind of intellectual work respond is. They're going to think, based potentially on their educational background, that means take a yes or no stance with that, right? And we may not actually want them to have that kind of simplistic approach to it, especially with somebody like Judith Butler, whose ideas and writing is very complex. And we may not totally have an opinion about all of it ourselves, because we may not understand it, right? So that's not going to help students figure out what kind of work they need to do. Again, we need to be specific in articulating what we'd like to see. So I always like to frame this as an activity, because I think we need to remind ourselves that students are doing a material kind of work, and a material kind of specific kind of activity, like they're producing something, right? And if we leave it too abstract, students aren't going to have a clear idea about what kind of work we're asking them to do. So in this case, it's a discussion board. We're most likely asking them to write, but you might be asking them to do a video. You might be asking them to do collaborative annotations. So we need to start with whatever that activity is. So for example, I usually start with write a brief discussion board post in which you, and that word brief helps students understand that I'm not looking for an essay, right? And in fact, I really don't want this to be an essay. We don't speak in essays, ideally, in a discussion in person, although I'm sure we've all had that person who does. But we do want it to be an actual discussion. We also want to provide specific guidelines for what we're looking for. And I'm not talking about word count in this case, right? When I'm talking about specific guidelines, I'm thinking about, if we want, we're looking for students to somehow work with whoever X author is, or in my example, Judith Butler's ideas, right? But we need to help students figure out, in what ways they can actually do that. So research shows that providing more structure in discussion board posts helps students have more thoughtful, more deeply engaged, more nuanced discussions in which they are negotiating complex things. So for example, we might ask them to write a brief discussion board post in which you respond to, I don't know, Judith Butler's ideas by comparing them to your own prior knowledge or experience with gender that you maybe have in your own background or in your own practices. So this is a school of social work, so we're often thinking about what students' practical experience with these things may have been, but it doesn't have to be practice-based. And then we might further encourage them to do this by asking them specifically to reflect on at least 2 specific ideas from whatever article or chapter or Judith Butler, and compare them to at least 2 specific experience, prior topics of knowledge, et cetera, that student has had. So now we're asking students to make use of their own experiences because they do have experience with whatever we're asking them to think about, no matter what it is. Even chemistry, right? They've seen chemical reactions in real life happen, right? So we're asking them to engage those prior experiences to help generate that metacognitive element, right? To really think about what they know or understand. We need to be careful not to ask students to do too many different kinds of intellectual labor in one discussion board. Like, we shouldn't be asking them to compare and contrast and also critique ideas and also apply the ideas to a potential case study, right? That's going to be too much for students to manage, and they're probably going to leave one of those things out, not do any of them, etc. If we're going to be using questions to help prompt students, and this relates to what Rachel was saying earlier about these not being comprehension based, we usually want to do how or why questions and not what questions, depending on what kind of what question, right? So what questions generally have limited answers that are supposed to be right or wrong, or there's kind of, there's really clear kind of boundaries about what the response would be. So for example, building on this sample prompt that we've been designing, we can add on to the end. So they're reflecting on at least 2 specific ideas and 2 prior experiences. How does this author's ideas change the way you understand those experiences about gender performativity, maybe, or about how people perform their genders? How do your experiences allow you to see something different or new compared to Judith Butler? Is there something that maybe her discussion has left out about that you've seen in your own experience, right? Is there something that doesn't seem to be matching up that you're having a hard time reconciling? Okay, now we need to think about legibility. So students are going to see in that example I just gave you, that big paragraph of instructions and not really be able to parse what they're being asked to do or think about, or, we need to essentially help students prioritize, right? So this is a large paragraph. Where am I supposed to start? I'm going to get lost. I'm probably not even going to read those questions at the end, or maybe I'm going to skip to the questions at the end and just look at those and miss that maybe I'm being asked to think about 2 specific ideas, right? So we'll want to break this out into instructions and bullet points. So I like to start with just, okay, you're going to be writing a brief discussion in which you're responding to Judith Butler, comparing them to your own knowledge experience, and then a colon that leads into then, okay, that's the work you're going to be doing. Now here's the specific guidelines. You need to be talking at least about 2 specific ideas and then 2 specific experiences. And then, to help prompt you in comparing and reflecting, here's some questions you should be asking yourself so that they know they don't necessarily need to do, okay, question 1, here's my answer to question 1, question 2, here's my answer to that. But rather, these questions are supposed to help me formulate what's going to be a more narrativized response, right? Not just a list, although there can be discussion board prompts that are perfectly fine to have students respond to in lists. It depends on what work you're asking students to do. So kind of building off these points, we now need to think about particularly discussion responses or discussion replies. And as Rachel was saying earlier, this is kind of a point of contention among instructors. They feel like they're not really getting super useful replies from students. And honestly, part of that may be because there's not often, at least in our experience, specific guidelines about how students should be replying to each other. There might be general overall guidelines kind of given in the syllabus, But what happens when we actually start building specific prompts for these? So research has again shown that the more structure we give students, the more that actually students engage with each other, and also the more times that they might be compelled to respond to each other. They're still going to be thinking, okay, I do my one response that I'm required to do. But if the responses are more structured and more nuanced, that's going to foster more opportunities for students to respond to each other. So again, we want to always ask ourselves some questions before we start actually doing this, right? So we're going to go back to that question I mentioned earlier, which is, what is the benefit of students sharing their responses to the above, for example, the above example prompt that I've been working with? What will they be able to think or learn by considering what their peers have had to say, right? So how are they going to benefit from getting multiple views about whatever this thing is? What impacts will their peers' replies have on their practices and or their thinking? And if you can't come up with a good answer to this, maybe it needs to be a low stakes individual reflection or something instead, and something else maybe should be the main discussion prompt, right? But they should be getting some sort of further thinking or complication of their own ideas from each other. We also need to ask, what kind of open-ended opportunities does whatever original prompt we worked on allow for? What kinds of complexity and nuance might arise, particularly based on the topic? And there is plenty of nuance and complexity about gender, right? So we, in fact, if that was our example, we might even need to make sure that we're really directing students about what kind of discussion we're having, because that could really go in some unintended directions that also may verge into some uncomfortable territory for some students, right? So we want to make sure that we're offering some discussions or some structure about what kind of discussion the students will be having. And we can also be asking ourselves, how can students either make use of their own experiences or imagine applying content from this module to their experiences and or practices? So we can consider how they can bring in media, their own professional experience, their personal experience and background, et cetera. And the more that students do that, the more they'll benefit from seeing each other's experiences, right? How can them learning about each other's experiences or whatnot help them shape their own ideas? We don't want discussion responses to be particularly long. They already wrote the original discussion. We're often asking them to respond to multiple people, right? But we also want them to actually substantively engage with each other, right? So response prompts should be specific about what students are responding to and what they should be trying to think through or think about, right? So on to sort of the more concrete aspects now. We want students to make sure that they're making use of and or describing their main takeaways from their peers. So again, this is supported by the research across all kinds of things, not only discussions, but also essays, et cetera. It helps the student writing the reply to synthesize and use the knowledge their peer contributed and really think through, okay, what was my peer saying? And it also helps the peer who originally wrote whatever they said get good feedback about how they communicated their ideas, something getting taken in a way that they didn't initially intend. Did they miss thinking about something they should have? Did they accidentally communicate something they don't actually think? It's also useful for students to consider how they could expand on their peer's point or something else that maybe their peer should consider moving forward when thinking about this topic. Students are often nervous to criticize each other. So framing it in these terms of more to consider or something like that helps students kind of get over that if they're just seeing it more as offering suggestions for further thinking rather than, I have to tell my peer they're wrong. So here's an example that builds off of our earlier prompt. So we could say, how does your peers' discussion help you think differently about your own experiences with topic? What did they discuss that was particularly interesting or useful to you and why? So we get some, again, synthesizing that knowledge and repeating it back. But now we want to complicate that. So what about your own experiences or understanding do you think could expand on your peers' thoughts? What else could they consider to develop or modify their thoughts or understanding of this author's points? So we've already asked the students to think about their own experiences in the main prompt, and now we want them to make use of those experiences they were writing about that they've already been thinking about in order to complicate or trouble what their peers have to say, right? So we're just going to kind of leave this now to think about this in your own context. What exactly a discussion looks like that does all these things is going to vary based on unique context, whether that's the discipline. I'm sure that's often a big concern for instructors, individual disciplines, but also the communities that your students are in, the types of programs, if they're undergraduate, master's, doctoral level, right? Certificate, etc. Nonetheless, there are guidelines that hold true kind of almost no matter what the context, which is that we're prioritizing formative discussions that are also structured and allow students to really inquire about complex topics and ideas collaboratively that allows them also to think about their own learning and experiences. So if you have any further thoughts about any of this, feel free to contact us. Again, my name is Alex Gatten, and my email is alex.gatten@rutgers.edu.
Thanks everyone for listening. I hope that you're walking away with some good tips and tricks to review your discussion boards. And my email is up there, Rachel Schwartz, rschwartz@ssw.rutgers.edu.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.